All right, so welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive with us. This time, we're looking into the recent New York prison strike.
Yeah,
And this is something that I think a lot of people heard about in the news,
for sure.
but maybe didn't get the full picture.
Yeah, definitely a lot of layers to this one.
Yeah, and you've sent over a whole bunch of articles and reports, so I can tell that you
Oh.
want to kind of get to the bottom of this.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a really complex situation with a lot of moving parts, and I think it's important to try to see it from, multiple angles.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my first question is just kind of set the stage for people.
Sure.
What exactly happened? Like, how did this whole thing start?
Well, it all kicked off on February 17th when corrections officers at two facilities, Collins and Elmira, walked off the job. It wasn't a planned strike organized by their union, though. It was what they call a wildcat strike.
Oh, so like a spontaneous thing.
Exactly. Totally unplanned and not officially sanctioned. It kind of shows you how desperate the situation was.
Yeah, I mean, to risk your job like that.
Exactly. They must have felt like they had no other choice.
Wow. And how widespread did this become?
Oh, it spread like wildfire. Within days, pretty much all 42 prisons in the state were affected. To put that into perspective, New York hasn't seen a prison strike of this magnitude in over 40 years.
Oh, 40 years. Wow, so this was a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it really highlights just how deep-rooted these issues are. This wasn't just a sudden outburst. There's a long history here.
So what were some of the main things that were driving this like wave of protest, I guess?
Well, the corrections officers had a whole list of grievances, but the one they kept coming back to was severe understaffing. And we're not talking about a few empty positions here. We're talking chronically short-staffed to the point where it was putting their safety at risk.
Right, because if you don't have enough officers to manage the inmate population, things can get out of control pretty quickly.
Exactly, and that's exactly what they were saying. They were constantly working in dangerous conditions, feeling outnumbered and outmatched.
I can only imagine how stressful that must be, going to work every day knowing you're at risk.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the understaffing itself, but the knock-on effects, like the mandatory overtime.
Oh, right, because if there aren't enough officers to cover all the shifts, someone has to work those extra hours.
Exactly. Some of these officers were pulling double, even triple shifts.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were working 24 hours straight.
24 hours. That's insane. I mean, how can anyone function properly after that?
Right. It's not only exhausting, but also incredibly dangerous. When you're that fatigued, it's harder to stay alert, make good decisions. And in a prison environment, that can have some pretty serious consequences.
Yeah, I can see how that would create a really volatile situation. So it sounds like these working conditions were taking a huge toll on the officers, both physically and mentally.
Absolutely, no doubt about that.
But there's another layer to this story too, right? This HALT law seems to have been a major point of contention.
Yeah, that's right. The HALT law, or the Humane Alternatives to Long-Term Solitary Confinement Act, was passed in 2021. The goal was to limit the use of solitary confinement in New York prisons.
Okay, and solitary confinement has been pretty controversial, right? A lot of people consider it to be inhumane.
Exactly. There's a lot of debate about the psychological effects of solitary, especially long-term solitary.
So the HAL law was trying to make things more humane for the inmates.
Yeah, it set limits on how long someone could be held in solitary and required a hearing before they could be placed there.
Okay, so on the surface, it seems like a positive step.
Right, but the corrections officers had a very different perspective.
They did.
Oh yeah, they argued that the HAL law actually made their jobs more dangerous.
How so?
Well, they felt like it restricted their ability to maintain order and discipline within the prisons. They were already working in a risky environment, and they felt like this law was tying their hands.
So they felt like they were being asked to do their job with one hand tied behind their back.
Pretty much. And this is where things get really complicated, because you have this clash of perspectives,
Right, you have the safety and well-being of the officers.
Yeah.
And then you have the humane treatment of the inmates.
Exactly. And finding that balance, well, that's a real challenge.
It seems like a no-win situation almost.
Yeah, it really is a dilemma.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers here. And this debate is something that goes way beyond just New York.
You think so?
Oh, absolutely. It taps into a much larger societal question about how we view punishment versus rehabilitation, and what level of dignity and rights should be afforded to people who are incarcerated.
That's a really good point. It's not just about a labor dispute. It's about these deeper ethical and philosophical questions that we, as a society, need to grapple with.
Exactly.
And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, I think.
Absolutely. There's a lot to unpack here.
There is.
For sure.
Yeah. And I think it's important that we try to understand it from all sides so we can have a more informed and nuanced conversation about these really important issues.
I think that's key, yeah.
Yeah.
To really get to the heart of the matter.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, this is already giving me a lot to think about.
Yeah, me too.
But I know there's still a lot more to cover. So we'll take a quick break and then we'll come back and we'll dive into the next part of this story.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
Okay.
Yeah. It really is a tangled web for sure. So while all this was happening, Governor Hochul had a tough job,
Yeah, I bet.
trying to balance the demands of a powerful union,
Right.
public safety concerns, and the rights of the incarcerated population.
It sounds like a real tightrope walk.
It was, for sure.
Yeah.
So what does she do? Well, first off, she deployed over 3,500 National Guard troops.
Wow.
To fill the gaps left by the striking officers.
That's a lot of troops.
Yeah, it shows how seriously the state was taking the situation.
I can imagine that must have been a logistical nightmare.
Oh, yeah. Trying to get all those troops trained up and ready to work in a prison environment, it was definitely a short-term solution.
Yeah, like a Band-Aid.
Exactly. But Hochul also applied some legal pressure,
Oh, how's...
She threatened the striking officers with loss of pay, benefits, even potential legal action.
Right, because technically they weren't allowed to strike.
Exactly. Striking by corrections officers is illegal in New York. So she was playing hardball, but also trying to find a way to resolve the situation.
Right, so kind of like a carrot and stick approach.
Yeah, you could say that. And eventually, both sides came to the table and negotiated an agreement.
Okay, so they managed to hammer something out.
They did. They called it a consent award, which is important because it means it's legally binding for both sides.
Ah, so this wasn't just a handshake agreement.
Nope, there are real consequences if either side backs out.
So what were some of the key parts of this agreement?
Well, for the officers, a big win was that there would be no disciplinary action taken against them for striking as long as they returned to work by a certain date.
Oh, so like an amnesty in exchange for ending the strike.
You got it. It must have been a huge relief for a lot of them who were facing losing their jobs and pensions.
Yeah, I bet. So the state wanted to get things back to normal ASP, but did this agreement actually address any of the underlying issues?
Well, some, to an extent. One thing was the overtime pay. They bumped it up from 1.5 to 2.5 times their regular rate.
Oh, wow. So a pretty significant increase.
Yeah, it addressed the immediate financial burden for a lot of officers who were working all those crazy hours.
Makes sense. If you're constantly pulling double shifts, that extra pay would definitely help.
Absolutely. But it's more of a Band-Aid than a long-term solution.
Right. It doesn't solve the underlying problem of understaffing.
You're right.
Yeah.
And that's where the committees come in.
Committees.
Yeah, the agreement also included the formation of committees to study staffing levels at each facility and recommend ways to improve efficiency.
I've heard that one before.
Yeah, it's a classic. But the idea is to find a way to reduce the reliance on mandatory overtime in the long run.
Well, I hope it works. But committees can be notoriously slow and bureaucratic.
That's a valid concern. We'll have to wait and see if they actually lead to meaningful change or just become another layer of red tape.
Fingers crossed. And what about the HALT law? Did the agreement address that at all?
It did, and it was probably the most controversial part. So remember how parts of it were suspended during the strike?
Yeah.
Well, the agreement kept those parts on hold for another 90 days.
So even though the strike's over, this law aimed at protecting inmates is still essentially on pause.
Yeah, pretty much. During those 90 days, the state is supposed to evaluate whether fully reinstating the HA law would be too risky.
Too risky for who?
Well, they're saying for both staff and inmates, but it feels like a slippery slope to me,
I see what you mean. Like, who gets to decide what constitutes an unreasonable risk, and what message does it send to the inmates that a law designed to protect them is on hold because of a strike?
Exactly. It raises a lot of important questions. And while all this was going on, we can't forget about the people actually inside the prisons.
Right, we've been talking a lot about the officers, but the impact on the inmates must have been huge.
It was definitely. I read some reports about the conditions at the Woodbourne Correctional Facility, and it sounded pretty rough.
What was happening there?
Well, inmates lost access to phones, no hot meals, the commissary was shut down.
Wow. That's...
Yeah, I mean, it might seem like small things to us on the outside,
Right.
But when it's your daily life, when you rely on those things for basic communication and food.
Yeah, it must have been incredibly difficult.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that these are real people caught in the middle of this conflict.
Absolutely. And it's easy to forget about the human cost when we're talking about these big political and legal battles.
And sadly, there were even 3 deaths at different facilities during the strike.
Oh, wow, I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah, they're still investigating the causes, but it shows how serious the situation was.
It's tragic.
It really is. So, we have this agreement. It's supposed to bring some stability.
Right.
But there are still so many unanswered questions.
Yeah, like what happens after those 90 days? Will the HALT law be fully reinstated?
Exactly. And will those committees actually make a difference in staffing levels?
It feels like we're just kicking the can down the road.
I think you're right. And even if they do address those specific issues, there's a bigger problem.
What's that?
The mediator in this case, Martin Scheinman, he said the relationships between everyone involved.
The state, the union, the officers?
Yeah, all of them, yeah. He said those relationships are deeply fractured. There's just this lack of trust that goes way beyond any single law or agreement.
So even if they fix the immediate problems, those underlying tensions are still there.
Exactly, like a simmering pot, just waiting to boil over again.
That's a worrying thought.
Yeah.
It does feel like we're just kind of like pausing the conflict instead of really getting to the root of it.
It is. It's like slapping a Band-Aid on a deep wound.
Right.
It might stop the bleeding for a bit,
Right.
but it doesn't address the underlying infection.
Exactly.
Mm.
So what happens next? Like, what are the potential long-term consequences of all of this, both for the officers and for the inmates?
Well, one thing that worries me is that this strike could embolden corrections officers in other states. We're already seeing a rise in labor activism across a bunch of different sectors.
Mhm.
And this success, even if it's a partial success,
Right.
it might inspire others to take similar action, to fight for better working conditions.
So this could be a sign of things to come, like a wave of unrest in the prison system that goes beyond New York.
It's definitely a possibility. And then there's the question of, what happens to the relationship between the officers and the inmates moving forward.
Yeah, that's got to be strained after all of this.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The strike and the whole HALT law situation, it's created a lot of tension and mistrust on both sides.
It's hard to see how you come back from that. How do you rebuild a sense of safety and cooperation when there's been such a breakdown in trust?
It's a huge challenge, and honestly, I don't think it's being talked about enough.
Really?
Yeah, everyone's focused on the politics and the legal battles.
Uh-huh.
But at the end of the day, it's the people on the ground, both the officers and the inmates,
Right.
who have to live with the consequences.
So, zooming out a bit, what does this whole strike tell us about the state of our prison system as a whole?
Well, I think it really lays bare some deep systemic flaws, We're asking corrections officers to do this incredibly difficult and dangerous job,
Yeah.
often without giving them the support or resources they need.
Right.
And at the same time, we're warehousing people in these overcrowded, often inhumane conditions.
Uh-huh.
And that just creates this pressure cooker environment where tensions are constantly running high.
It sounds like we're setting everyone up for failure.
In a lot of ways, we are. And the sad thing is, this isn't new, We've been dealing with these issues for decades,
Right.
but they seem to be getting worse, not better.
So, is there any hope for real change? Like, what can we do?
I think there is hope, but it requires us to really rethink how we approach the whole system, We need to move away from this purely punitive mindset and focus more on rehabilitation and reintegration.
So, like, less about punishment and more about helping people get back on their feet.
Exactly. We need to invest in programs that address the root causes of crime, support people while they're incarcerated,
Right.
and create pathways for them to successfully re-enter society.
It sounds like we need to overhaul the entire system.
It's a tall order, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think it's necessary if we want to create a system that's actually just and humane.
Well, this has been really eye-opening, and it's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
And I think that's the value of these deep dives, right? It's not just about getting the facts. It's about understanding the complexities,
Yeah.
the different perspectives, the human stories behind the headlines.
Absolutely. And it's about starting a conversation, right? We're not going to solve these problems overnight, but we can start by talking about them, by challenging our own assumptions, and by demanding better from our leaders.
I completely agree. So for everyone listening, this deep dive has just scratched the surface, But hopefully it's given you a better understanding of what happened with this New York prison strike.
Yeah, and the broader issues it raises.
And if you're as intrigued by all of this as we are, we encourage you to keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a more just and humane criminal justice system.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to uncover here.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.